Within the first minutes of Oppenheimer, the audience is aware that the story is split into two parts. The color, fission sequences are told from Oppenheimer's perspective, and the fusion, black and white sequences told from Lewis Strauss's perspective. The runtime of Oppenheimer is exactly 180 minutes and 9 seconds, or roughly 3 hours. It was classified as R-rated and is a biopic about a scientist in World War II, in a world where the highest grossing films are typically superhero movies and cinematic universes. And yet, Oppenheimer in many ways was the biggest success of 2023, grossing nearly $1 billion, with 7 Oscar wins, including one for Best Picture and one for Best Director. The biggest takeaway is that despite its conditions, Oppenheimer resonated strongly with audiences, and most importantly, it wasn't boring. The answer lies in Oppenheimer's story structure, but this video isn't about a two-part structure, because I don't think Oppenheimer's story is split into 2 parts. I think it's split into 3. A story structure is defined as the sequence and backbone of a story, most commonly told in a linear storyline, split into rising action, the climax, and resolution. But Oppenheimer's story isn't told in a linear way, and even though the film could be split into rising action, climax, and resolution, those aren't exactly the 3 parts I'm talking about. Now of course, Oppenheimer isn't the first story to be told non-chronologically. Non-linear storylines have been used in cinema for decades. A notable example is Pulp Fiction. Pulp Fiction's story is split into 3 narratives: Vincent and Jules, Vincent taking Mia out, and Butch versus Marcellus Wallace, which cut between each other throughout the film. But the story structure is actually broken up even further into 7 chapters, which are told out of order, meaning that halfway through the film, spoiler alert, Vincent dies. But the film ends with Vincent and Jules leaving the diner, as if walking off into the sunset.
I think we should be leaving now.
Yeah, that's probably a good idea.
Chapters are used here out of order, to make the day-in-the-life narratives for each character more interesting than if they were told chronologically. But the use of chapters doesn't necessarily mean a non-linear story. Chapters are also used in Inglourious Basterds, but this time the story is told chronologically, and the purpose of chapters is to help orient the audience better as we cut between Shoshana, the Bastards, and of course General Hans Landa. This is closer to how Nolan segmented the story structure in Dunkirk, which also involves 3 cross-cutting narratives: the mole for a week, the sea for a day, and the air for an hour. In this case, segmenting the story is done to cover multiple aspects of the evacuation of Dunkirk, whilst also building tension, as if each segment had equal time periods, we would have less of Harry Styles and co escaping from the beach, and more scenes of Tom Hardy in a Spitfire dogfight, which actually doesn't sound that bad, but would have built less tension overall. Likewise, Oppenheimer wasn't Nolan's first time using colour and black and white cinematography to segment the story structure. The technique is used in Memento, with colour scenes running in reverse order and black and white scenes representing a different timeline running in a forwards order, which coincidentally makes Oppenheimer the second film in a row where Nolan reused a technique from Memento. In both films, Nolan converges the separated storylines over the course of the film, but the colour and black and white scenes in Oppenheimer don't quite work in the same way. While it's true that as the colour sequences progress through Oppenheimer's life, we get closer to the involvement of Strauss and the timeline of the black and white scenes, the timeline of the film is all over the place, even more so than Dunkirk. But the main reason you can't call Oppenheimer's story a 2-part structure is because it's called Oppenheimer, not Oppenheimer vs. Strauss' Dawn of Political Justice, not Oppenheimer vs. Strauss' Civil War in Princeton, just Oppenheimer. And if you watch the film, you know the vast majority of scenes are in colour, from Oppenheimer's perspective. Strauss' story, his hearings, his need to get back at Oppenheimer, his desire to be in Eisenhower's cabinet are all secondary to Oppenheimer's story. It's pretty apt that the film ends with Strauss thinking Einstein and Oppenheimer were talking about him, when in fact they were talking about something
More important.
If Strauss watched the film, he'd probably argue that it's a 2-part structure, but he'd be wrong. So why does the film have a 3-part structure, and not just a 1-part all Oppenheimer structure? The reason is genre. With Oppenheimer, Christopher Nolan didn't want to make a biopic, because a true biopic, telling a person's life from birth to death,
fails you completely as a genre. It's not a useful genre.
or in Tarantino's words, a biopic is a cough cough boring movie. Instead, you have to do a comic book version of their whole life. And so for Oppenheimer, Nolan crafted a story split into 3 parts, separated by 3 genres. Now, comparing Oppenheimer to a superhero's origin story seems like a complete mismatch in genre. One represents a 3-hour biopic about a scientist in World War II, and the other represents the beginning of a multi-billion-dollar trilogy about a comic book character. But in the first act of Oppenheimer, there are actually more similarities to the origin story, or as Nolan calls it, part hero's journey. The very first scene of Batman Begins is when he is a child, and his parents are still alive. But we immediately cut to him as an adult, after he has left Gotham. Similarly, the first shot of Oppenheimer is a young Oppenheimer staring at raindrops falling, and we then cut to a face. J. Robert Oppenheimer, aged 50, peer into my soul. After a failed attempt at getting revenge, Bruce Wayne travels away from America and eventually ends up at the League of Shadows, where he trains in martial arts and develops the skill necessary to be Batman. Likewise, Oppenheimer is initially at Cambridge, away from America to learn quantum physics. But just like how Bruce Wayne struggles to control his vengeful emotions, Oppenheimer struggles with
visions of a hidden universe.
So he travels to Holland to learn quantum theory in the Can You Hear the Music sequence, just like Bruce Wayne climbed up the mountain to join the League of Shadows. In both stories, Nolan's intention is to introduce the character and their motivations to the story, and show us, the audience, how they put these motivations into action. In both films, this means the protagonist returning to America with their newly discovered knowledge. Bruce Wayne, with his training from the League of Shadows, suits up to become Batman, fighting crime and corruption in Gotham.
I'm Batman.
Oppenheimer, with his training in European theoretical physics, brings quantum theory to America, and even has his own suit-up sequence where he becomes the iconic J. Robert Oppenheimer. But this is where both stories diverge. Batman Begins continues as an action thriller, as Batman has to fight Liam Neeson and an evil microwave his company built.
Where are you?
Instead, Oppenheimer takes a different approach, becoming something else entirely. A heist film. Comparing Oppenheimer's second act to a heist film is again an odd choice, given that our protagonists aren't a group of criminals, there is no bank robbery, there's not even a crime being committed, excluding the construction of humanity's deadliest ever weapon. Instead, Oppenheimer's second act shares the same plot points and characteristics as those from the heist genre, which is why our best point of reference for this act is another film that crosses over genres, but that has the hallmarks of a heist film, Christopher Nolan's Inception. Inception is a difficult film to try and categorize. You could call the film a science fiction movie based on the dream-sharing concept, which the film is about, but at the core is Cobb's journey to get back to his children, which suggests a more heartfelt action film, bringing the addiction to the dream world Cobb has, so that he can see the projection of his late wife whose death he has guilt for, and you have a psychological thriller. But if we look at the story structure of Inception, it mostly follows that of the heist genre. The first aspect of this is the recruitment of the heist, when the lead character recruits people to build their crew, like in GTA heists when you're selecting each member and what cut to give them.
Alright, let's lock in, yo. Give me all the money.
Nope.
This swipe the least amount.
Nah, Zane, give Zane 1%.
5%. Shut the fuck up.
And in Inception, this recruitment happens once Cobb accepts Saito's job.
Assemble your team, Mr. Cobb, and choose your people more wisely.
First he goes to Paris and recruits Ariadne as an architect, then he goes to Mombasa, meets Eames as his forger, has a little chase, and picks up Yusuf as a chemist. Then once our team is assembled, comes the second aspect, the planning. Here Nolan uses a montage, with the characters deciding what idea to plant.
I will split up my father's empire. Now, this is obviously an idea that Robert himself would choose to reject, which is why we need to plant it deep in his subconscious. The subconscious is motivated by emotion, right? Not reason. Now, Robert's relationship with his father is stressed, to say the least.
Well, can we run with that? We could suggest to him breaking up his father's company as a screw you to the old man.
The logistics of the job.
On the top level, we open up his relationship with his father. Then the next level down, we feed him. I will create something for myself. Then, by the time we hit the bottom level, we bring out the big guns.
My father doesn't want me to be him.
Exactly.
as well as providing important exposition on the synchronized kick.
What's a kick?
This, Ariadne, would be a kick.
All done in a neat 4-minute sequence. But in Oppenheimer, we can't quite do the same, because the heist part of the movie takes place over one act, instead of an entire 2.5-hour movie. Instead, both the planning and recruitment takes place over a montage, cutting between planning on a train, recruiting in a classroom, and shouting in a corridor.
How about because this is the most important thing to ever happen in the history of the world?
At the start of the montage, we also get to see part of why Oppenheimer is such a good leader.
Keep the Rad Lab here at Berkeley, under Lawrence, Met Lab in Chicago under Zillard, all America's industrial might and scientific innovation, connected by rail, focused on one goal, one point in space and time, and it comes together here.
Once the planning and recruitment sequences are done in both films, we get to see the actual heists. In Inception, this is going through the 3 layers of the dream to plant the idea in Fisher's head, while in Oppenheimer, this is the construction of the bomb or gadget, with fish bowls filled with marbles representing the extraction of uranium and plutonium needed for the bomb. But just like in any other heist movie, everything doesn't go according to plan, which is where the need to set up the third act is necessary. In Inception, the heist doesn't go to plan because of Mal,
No.
which is why there's a 10 to 15 minute scene in the middle of the heist explaining Mal's backstory, so that we care for her, and so that we care for the plot twist of Cobb causing his wife's death through Inception. But in Oppenheimer, the heist actually does go according to plan, and the Trinity test is a success. Instead, the problem Nolan sets up for the third act is about the success of the Manhattan Project, in what he calls the courtroom drama.
It worked.
Even though The Social Network doesn't technically happen in a courtroom, it's basically a courtroom drama. And out of all the films that Oppenheimer's been compared to, this film is by far the most similar. And not just because it's also a biopic about a genius with an ego problem. Both Oppenheimer and The Social Network tell their stories with a crosscut between biographical scenes and the security clearance / deposition hearings, which doesn't just apply to the final act, but to the whole film instead. But Nolan is no stranger to a crosscut, and I'd go as far to say it's the most defining feature of all his films. So why is it that Oppenheimer feels so different to any of Nolan's other films, and feels closer to a David Fincher film instead? Well, that's because Nolan has usually used crosscuts to build tension in specific scenes. For example, in the climax for The Dark Knight Rises, we cut between Batman in the Bat, Catwoman on the Batpod, and Gordon / Joseph Gordon-Levitt on the ground, with each cut between storylines building more tension than if each story was separate. Even when crosscuts were used for more than just a scene, like in Inception's final act or the entirety of Dunkirk, they were still used with the primary purpose of building tension. But in Oppenheimer and The Social Network, the primary purpose of crosscutting is simply to tell the story. Instead of starting the movie with the scene of young Oppenheimer, the first scene we have is Oppenheimer at his security clearance hearing, where he is asked,
Were you happier there than in America?
to which Oppenheimer replies,
Happier?
Yes.
No.
but instead of simply hearing Oppenheimer's answer in the boardroom,
Were you happier there than in America?
Happier?
Yes.
we cut to a young Oppenheimer
No.
lying in bed, staring up, crying. But Oppenheimer's security clearance hearing isn't the only courtroom drama used to tell the story. Strauss's Senate hearing mirrors Oppenheimer's due to both not being actual trials, with
No burden of proof.
and the fact that
We're not convicting. Just denying.
we also have the black and white sections to give us Louis Strauss's perspective on the same events where the two rivals clash. There are multiple scenes shown from both perspectives, which all share one important theme. Oppenheimer doesn't care about Strauss. Take the isotopes hearing, for example. From Strauss's perspective, in his own words,
They drafted in Robert to make me look like a fool.
but from Oppenheimer's perspective on the same scene, the first mention of Strauss in the screenplay, and the first time we see him, is at the end of his speech.
How'd I do?
Maybe a little too well, Robert.
In black and white, Strauss is in the audience. In colour, the room is all chuckles and smiles at his performance. The same applies to the AEC meeting discussing Russia's nuclear test, where instead of worrying about straws, Oppenheimer zones out, thinking about the monster he's created. Aaron Sorkin uses a similar technique in The Social Network, with Eduardo Saverin and Mark Zuckerberg pitted against each other as rivals, just like Oppenheimer and Strauss. But unlike Oppenheimer, the main character isn't the hero, and his rival isn't the villain. Sorkin also uses two hearings to tell Zuckerberg's story, cutting between Facebook's origins, the Eduardo Saverin deposition, and the deposition of the Winklevoss twins. Both Nolan and Sorkin use the multiple hearings / perspective to not only make a more interesting story, but also to change our perception of Zuckerberg and Oppenheimer. From the opening scene of The Social Network, we know Zuckerberg to be a bit of an asshole based on his treatment of Erica.
I have to go study.
You don't have to study.
Why do you keep saying I don't have to study?
Because you go to BU.
But early scenes in The Social Network also show his brilliance, which makes us root for him despite his bluntness.
I see we have our first surrender. Don't worry, Mr. Zuckerberg. Brighter men than you have tried and failed this class.
One valid bit, one modified bit, one reference bit, 5 permission bits.
That is correct.
Nolan also presents a mixed picture of Oppenheimer in early scenes. We sympathize with most scenes from Oppenheimer's perspective, although his arrogance shows through in his treatment of David Hill.
Do we really need that in the notes?
But the early black and white scenes paint an entirely different picture, and for the first half of the film, I actually rooted for Strauss, for how he was made fun of at the Isotopes hearing, or how Oppenheimer looked down on him at seemingly every interaction.
Louis Strauss was once a lowly shoe salesman.
No, just a shoe salesman.
But as the films progress, and we cross-cut between the protagonist's life and their future hearings, our perception changes. We see a darker and more arrogant side of Zuckerberg, as Sean Parker joins Facebook and creates the beginnings of a feud with Saverin. Meanwhile, in the second act, most scenes are colour with Oppenheimer's perspective, so naturally we side more with him. Then in the third act, Nolan fully embraces the courtroom drama, with back-to-back scenes of hearings and discussions of said hearings. That makes us sympathise even more with Oppenheimer as he fights both the political witch hunt and his inner demons. But as the tension increases, and the elastic band keeps getting stretched and stretched and stretched, eventually it snaps, and the true villain of the story is revealed. In The Social Network, this is the now famous scene, when we find out in his quest for more investment, Mark Zuckerberg chose to dilute only his best friend's shares.
What was Mr. Zuckerberg's ownership share diluted down to?
It wasn't.
What was Sean Parker's ownership share diluted down to?
It wasn't.
And what was your ownership share diluted down to?
0.03%.
Choosing money and greed over the one person who stood by him. A betrayal to Saverin and a betrayal to the audience. And in Oppenheimer,
it wasn't Nichols or Hoover, one of Truman's guys,
who gave the file to Borden, setting in motion Oppenheimer losing his security clearance.
It was you. You gave the file to Borden, you set him on Oppenheimer, you convinced him.
Borden didn't take any convincing.
A betrayal to the audience who sympathized with Strauss at the beginning of the film, but a revelation we knew was coming.
Amateurs seek the sun, get eaten. Power stays in the shadows.
The Social Network concludes as the cross-cutting stops, with the resolution of Mark Zuckerberg's depositions. The result is a neutral ending.
They're gonna settle.
Oh yeah. And you're gonna have to pay a little extra.
Oppenheimer's hearings conclude in a similar, neutral way. Oppenheimer, the protagonist, loses his security clearance.
Don't dig at the sheets.
But at the same time, Strauss, the antagonist, also loses his Senate confirmation hearing.
I'm denied. Yeah?
I'm afraid so, sir.
All right.
But Oppenheimer's final shot isn't in either of these rooms. Its last shots are much more open-ended, sharing more similarities with Batman Begins and Inception. Batman Begins ends with a theme of escalation. Nolan teases the Joker to represent an escalating force of crime. But at this point, the filmmakers didn't know if there would be a sequel. Instead, the ending is open-ended. The hero's origin story is complete, but his adventures continue as he drops from the rooftop, gliding on the night wind. Inception ends with a successful heist, as Cobb wakes up against all odds. But the ending isn't about the heist or even dreams. The importance of the last shot is that Cobb no longer cares about whether he is in a dream or reality. All he cares about is that he is with his children. The spinning top is still spinning, and we cut. Oppenheimer's ending isn't like either of these films, and like all of them at the same time. The hero achieves his target, the heist is successful, and the result of the courtroom drama is neutral. But we don't end with the protagonist ready for the next adventure, a protagonist at peace, or even on a slightly positive note. But that's what elevates Oppenheimer to being such a good film. It combines 3 different genres, 3 stories, 3 eras in Oppenheimer's life, which reflects the filmmaking process in which his story was told. The first act, the abstract and creative process of a man finding himself. The second act, the logistical and actual making of the story, where the most important events unfold. And the third act, where everything comes together and the effects of the unfolded events are realized, which make a 3-hour biopic filled with boardroom talking scenes and garden walking scenes and classroom talking scenes and horseback riding scenes feel like a fast-paced thriller filled with hope, putting you at the edge of your seat until the impending doom of reality comes crashing down